Ladies and gentlemen, our next presenter is a well-known person in this country, Admiral Jayannath Colombage, who was the former commander of the Sri Lankan Navy, chairman of Sri Lankan Corporation, and an advisor to the President on Maritime and Naval Hub, and a good friend of mine as well. So, Admiral Colombage's presentation is Maritime Security and Theories of Naval Warfare, Way Ahead for a Professional Navy. Over to you.
I use this one, right?
So this is the indicator for your time's up.
I use this one, right? Go to Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Permission from the chair and my dear friend Navy Commander and Admiral from US and all the great participants of this conference. During the next 10 minutes, I'll be talking to you about my research on the theme Maritime Security and Theories of Naval Warfare, Way Ahead for a Professional Navy. If you look at the Sri Lankan experience during the conflict, we experienced a prolonged armed conflict at sea for nearly 3 decades. The LTTE started as a very small insurgent force in the 1970s, grew up to be a force to reckon with, and they even achieved near conventional status as an army, minor navy, and a mini air force towards the end of the conflict. Now, I would link the growth of LTTE directly to the growth of the LTTE Maritime Wing, the Sea Tigers. And this was not a classic naval war. To me, the last classic naval war was 1982 Falkland War, where the two navies actually fought a conventional battle at sea. But both sides on this conflict used the ocean extensively. And the Sea Tigers were considered as a trendsetter in maritime terrorism. Why? Because they invented the suicide boat, they invented swarming tactics, they introduced the female suicide carders at sea, and they experimented with limpet mines to blast the ships, and they experimented with submersible to create havoc to the naval platforms at sea. So my research was on exploratory research, and I wanted to study the changing dynamics of the maritime environment and how the indigenous use of tactics and counter tactics played a role. And then also I wanted to study the applicability of the naval theories in the warfare that we, the Sri Lanka Navy, emerged victorious at the end. In that sense, I used 3 theories: the theory of asymmetric warfare, theory of sea control, and the theory of operational art. And my research questions were, how did the LTTE Sea Tigers evolve to be such a force to reckon with, capitalizing on the drawbacks of the Sri Lanka Navy? And then finally, what were the determinants of success which created or which emerged the Sri Lanka Navy as the victor? So I used qualitative unstructured interviews for my research, and I was able to interview a large cross-section of key stakeholders from the military, the civilian, the legal, the media, and also from the LTTE. And I use focus group discussion to gather information as well. And I use interpretive paradigm to evaluate my data, and I use grounded theory, and the coding was done by me taking asymmetric warfare as the core component of my research, and the sea control and operation art and the determinants of success as the subcategory of my coding. Now, when you look at asymmetric warfare, it's normally you have one big force and a small force, and then the small force will mostly try to use asymmetric tactics to gain advantage. So the war we had was not a war between two compatible forces. If you look at the Sri Lanka Navy, much bigger, much superior, much stronger. If you look at the Sea Tigers, quite small. But the Sea Tigers cleverly used range of asymmetric tactics to gain heavy advantage against the Sri Lanka Navy. And Sri Lanka Navy, with a conventional mindset, was not ready to change immediately to asymmetric concepts. And the Sea Tigers benefited immensely because the Navy was not developed the way it should have been, and the Sea Tigers were the beneficiary of this whole problem. And Sea Tigers always had a grand strategy, and then they worked towards it. And they used vigor and became a force to reckon with. On the side of the Sri Lanka Navy, it was mostly reactive and responsive to the evolving threat, that is with a conventional mindset. And we focus mainly on conventional platform and mainly the fast attack craft fleet of the Sri Lanka Navy. And then the Sea Tigers evolved, and they became a threat to the fast attack craft fleet with suicide boats and also swarming tactics. And to tell you that Sri Lanka Navy lost 20 fast attack craft due to LTTE, suicide and other attacks. So that indicates the significance of the Sea Tiger tactics. And then when the Sri Lanka Navy began applying asymmetric tactics much later in the war, the results were immediate and the outcome was in favor of them. Then Sri Lanka Navy also developed a grand strategy to defeat the Sea Tigers at sea. And that affected directly the fighting efficiency of the LTTE Sea Tigers. And then Sri Lanka Navy experienced through the war for nearly 3 decades, evolved through the war, and then finally they were able to regain the lost sea control away from the LTTE Sea Tiger. Now the asymmetric warfare actually confused the conventional leader, and therefore a very strong leadership was the need of the hour to combat with the Sea Tigers. And luckily for the Sri Lanka Navy, we had a very strong leadership at that most crucial time. And that leadership was able to change the decade-old conventional mindset into a war-winning strategy. And that meant the Sri Lanka Navy had to fight the same way the Sea Tigers fought with the Sri Lanka Navy. And then the Sri Lanka Navy was able to regain the initiative and the surprise. And Sri Lanka Navy surprised the Sea Tigers in terms of ends, ways and means, be that by the using of small boat tactics or destruction of the LTTE warehouse ships or the employment of special boat squadron for carrying out behind the enemy line attacks. The Sri Lanka Navy proved that even the stronger force can benefit immensely by using asymmetric tactics, and this is despite the common belief that normally it is the weaker force who use the asymmetric tactics. Then Handley in 1989 writing to a book says, the instant a combat unit began to break, its combat power rapidly dwindled to nothing, and victory was assured to the side remaining intact. This was the case with the Navy. Despite having casualties, losses, the Sri Lanka Navy did never break. It maintained somehow the status quo. However, when the pressure was applied, the LTTE began to break up and they lost the dominance at sea, and the Sri Lanka Navy became superior. Now looking at the theory of sea control is the ability to use the ocean for one's own purposes. The Grompert says, sea power is the product of economics, politics, technology, and geography. Let us quickly examine a comparison how the Sri Lanka Navy and the LTT Sea Tigers exploited these 4 criteria. Now, Sri Lanka Navy is the legitimate user of the sea, and they enjoyed government backing, funds from the treasury, and they enjoyed the geographical advantage. But on the side of the Sea Tigers, they were not the legitimate user of the sea, and they did not have a treasury to support them. They had to depend on the diaspora money, and they did not have large geographical areas to dominate. However, they exploited the ocean in a big way with a clear objective and a strategy. Then the third aspect of my research is how the operational art was applicable to the great victory that we had. In the operational art, there are 2 main characteristics, that is the simultaneity and the successiveness. And that means distribution of forces in a lateral manner, but in a very synchronized manner. Most part of the war, we did not have this, but we got it only towards the latter part of the war. And also the operational art talk about the factor of force. Now when you talk about the force, there are certain measurable attributes like the number, how many people you have, the logistics that you have, how is the command is affecting. But there are very important non-measurable factors such as the human element, the leadership, the discipline, the cohesion, and combat motivation. Now these 5 are equally important like the force level. And also the operation art suggests that we need a grand strategy. So finally, the grand strategy of the nation was translated into the military strategy, and then finally it was translated into a maritime strategy. The idea, the objective was to regain the sea control and to deny the same to the LTTE Sea Tigers. Now that brought immediate success. The Sri Lankan Navy was able to destroy the LTTE logistic network, and that reduced the fighting efficiency of the LTTE as a force, and then Navy was able to gather the initiative, and it made the LTTE and the Sea Tigers defensive and vulnerable, and then also prevented the LTTE leadership from escaping from battle. Now, Operation Art also talk about leadership as a very important criteria, and I would say the naval leadership was at its best at that time. And also, the operational art suggests that the leader should be creative and innovative, and we have seen many examples of those aspects as well. And also the willingness to accommodate out-of-the-box suggestions and ideas. And I believe that the operational art was a secret tool in the leadership aspect of the Navy. And also it talks about the human element, and it suggests that the human element is most important. And then the strategic communication plan of the government played a crucial role in developing this human skill or the human element. The entire country was seen as behind the armed forces to end the war. Also, the freedom of action is another important aspect. During most part of the war, the Sri Lankan Navy did not enjoy the freedom of action because they were responsive, they were reacting to the LTTE. And when the SLN changed the tactics, they were able to regain the freedom of action, and the results were immediate. And also the operational art talk about factor of time. Any military action required a greater consideration of factor of time. But here we fought for 25 plus years. So the factor of time was not a major consideration for most part of our war. But when the tempo increased after 2006, everything changed for good. And the legitimacy of just war, that is a very crucial, important aspect as per the operational art. Combat motivation is affected by character of war, justness of the course, the legitimacy, ideology, and so on. The LTT side, there was one leader, one ideology, and one war. And they kept their cadres motivated through that. But it was not the case with the Sri Lankan Navy. So also operational analysis and design during the latter part, whatever the Sri Lankan Navy did was properly designed and planned and not in ad hoc measures. So in my conclusion, the way forward for a professional Navy need to develop a comprehensive maritime strategy. This point was brought out by the previous two speakers as well. It's a time, and I do believe if we miss this time, we are not going to succeed. And need to understand threats in the maritime domain and commit resources to enhance maritime security. We paid dearly for not maintaining maritime security at a sufficient level. Then understanding theories and concepts of naval warfare. Now we look retrospectively the theories. We have won the war, now we try to see how we won the war. But if we have done the other way around, we would have saved more lives, it would have been more economical, and the war would have ended much earlier. And also, we have to develop the naval capabilities in a very systematic and proactive manner, not in a reactive and responsive manner. Effective leadership, we have to inculcate the leadership in our future generation of officers, actionable intelligence, and minimizing corruption. And use of strategic communication, that is a very negative point for the Navy, because people cannot see the Navy. Beyond the horizon, you can't see. So this is called the sea blindness of people. When the people cannot see the Navy, they will not support. And the political leaders are the people. When they don't see what they don't see, they are not going to support. So through strategic communication, we have to make aware about the requirement of developing the Navy. So ladies and gentlemen, with this, I come to the end of my presentation, and thank you very much.